After 30 years without seeing my brother, he greeted me with a sign, "Welcome, disappointment." I had something that would make him beg for my forgiveness. I stood frozen in the airport terminal, my carry-on gripped tightly in my hand. Despite 30 years of building a life away from this town, despite becoming Amelia Norton, respected pediatrician, mother of 2, and survivor, I was instantly 16 again. Vulnerable. Raw. Frank stood 20 feet away, tall and gray-haired. Now, but with the same cold eyes I remembered, those eyes that had once watched me pack my bags while he said nothing to stop our father from throwing me out. The cardboard sign in his hands wasn't some cruel joke. It was a declaration of war. Welcome. Disappointment. People in the terminal glanced awkwardly between us, some slowing their pace to witness the drama unfolding. I straightened my spine and walked toward him, heartbeat thundering in my ears. "Frank," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Charming as ever. He didn't smile, didn't blink. "Didn't think you'd actually show up. Thought you'd find another excuse to abandon us." "Dad died." "What did you expect me to do?" Frank scoffed, lowering his sign. "What you've always done. Nothing." He turned and started walking toward the exit. "Cars outside, unless you'd rather call a taxi." I followed him, swallowing the retorts burning my throat. This wasn't about him. This was about Dad, about finishing things properly. And about the manila envelope tucked in my suitcase, the one thing that could change everything. The drive to our childhood home was silent and suffocating. The familiar landmarks of Oak Ridge slid past the window, the high school where I'd once been valedictorian, the park where I'd had my first kiss, the church where Mom's funeral had been held without me. "Town's changed," I finally said. "Not as much as you have." Frank's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "Amelia Norton, MD big city doctor. Too important for her roots." I turned to look at him, really look at him. The bitter lines around his mouth, the tension in his jaw. 30 years hadn't softened him. If anything, he'd hardened further. "I sent cards every Christmas," I said quietly. "Birthday cards, too. For years." "Right." He laughed without humor. "Is that what you tell yourself to sleep at night?" "It's the truth. Your version of it." We pulled into the driveway of the Victorian house where we'd grown up. It looked smaller than I remembered, the blue paint faded, the garden overgrown. Dad had always been so proud of that garden. "Dad's funeral is tomorrow," Frank said, killing the engine. "You've got the guest room. Susan and the kids are coming over for dinner." His voice softened slightly when he mentioned his wife and children. "They're curious about their aunt who couldn't be bothered to meet them." The unfairness of it hit me like a physical blow. "Frank, you know that's not—" "Save it." He cut me off, climbing out of the car. "We both know why you left, why you stayed. Away. Let's not pretend this is some happy reunion." I sat there watching him walk up to the house, the screen door slamming behind him. His words echoed in my mind, twisted and wrong. He had no idea what really happened 30 years ago. No idea that Dad had tracked me down 5 years after I left, that we'd tentatively begun to rebuild before his stroke, that I'd been sending money to help with his care. That Dad had been planning to tell Frank everything. My hand went to my purse, feeling the outline of my phone. 3 missed calls from my daughter already, checking to see if I'd arrived safely. My real life, calling me back. Inside my suitcase, the envelope waited. Dad's letters. The amended will. The truth that Frank had kept buried for decades. I could turn around now. Go back to the airport. Let Frank live with his bitterness and lies. But I was done running. I was done being the family disappointment. Tomorrow, after we buried our father, Frank would learn exactly what disappointment truly meant. Dad's funeral was exactly as he would have wanted it. Simple, dignified, without excessive emotion. The small church was filled with familiar faces, aged versions of the people I'd left behind. Some nodded respectfully, others whispered behind their programs. That's her, the daughter who ran off. 30 years without visiting her own father. I heard Frank had to pay for everything himself. I sat in the front pew, painfully aware of the empty space between Frank and me. His wife Susan sat beside him, blonde and tight-lipped, occasionally placing a supportive hand on his knee. Their children, my niece and nephew I'd never met, sat beside her, looking uncomfortable in their funeral clothes. Frank had spent the morning playing the dutiful, grieving son. He'd greeted every guest, accepted every condolence with a stoic nod, even managed to shed a few tears during the eulogy. Not once did he acknowledge my presence. When it was my turn to speak, a hush fell over the church. My father was. I faltered, as I reached the pulpit, suddenly overwhelmed. The casket loomed before me, American flag draped over it for his military service. I hadn't seen Dad in person for almost 2 years, not since his second stroke had made travel difficult. Now I never would again. I looked up, met Frank's challenging stare, and found my voice. My father was a complicated man, strong-willed and traditional. He taught us perseverance, sometimes through difficult lessons. I swallowed hard. We didn't always understand each other, but in recent years we found our way back to each other. Frank's head snapped up, confusion crossing his face. Good. He hadn't known about our reconciliation, just as Dad had predicted. He told me once that his greatest regret was the time we lost, I continued, and that his greatest hope was that his children would find their way back to being family again. I returned to my seat, feeling Frank's eyes boring into me. The rest of the service passed in a blur of hymns and platitudes. Then it was over, and we were standing at the cemetery, watching them lower Dad into the ground beside Mom's grave. Would have been nice if you'd run your speech by me first, Frank muttered as people began to drift toward their cars. Making it sound like you and Dad were close. We were. In the end, he scoffed. Right, because weekly phone calls from halfway across the country makes you close. How would you know about our calls, Frank? Something flashed in his eyes, panic quickly masked by anger. Figure of speech. Mrs. Abernathy wants to know if you're coming to the reception, Susan interrupted, appearing at Frank's elbow. Up. Close. I could see the strain around her eyes, the brittleness of her smile. Hello, Amelia. I'm Susan. We spoke on the phone once, years ago. I remembered. She'd called to tell me Frank didn't want me at their wedding. Nice to finally meet you, I said, accepting her limp handshake. You have beautiful children. Thank you. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Jessica and Michael were excited to meet their aunt, weren't you? The teenagers shuffled forward, eyes downcast. Jessica, 16 and already beautiful, murmured a hello. Michael, younger by a couple years, just nodded. Your grandfather talked about you sometimes, Jessica said suddenly, ignoring her father's sharp look. He had your medical school graduation picture in his room. My throat tightened. Did he? Jessica, Frank warned. Let's go, people are waiting. The reception was held at the community center, a parade of casseroles and condolences. I stood awkwardly by the coffee urn, watching Frank receive hugs and sympathetic touches. The prodigal daughter returned was clearly not welcome among the inner circle of mourners. He's enjoying this, you know, a gravelly voice said beside me. I turned to find Irene Mackenzie, Dad's next-door neighbor for 40 years, leaning on her cane. Playing the grieving son. Your brother always did love being the center of attention. Hello, Mrs. Mackenzie, I said, surprised she'd approach me. It's been a long time. Too long, she said, fixing me with a sharp gaze. Your daddy missed you something fierce. especially after you two started talking again. I glanced around, lowering my voice. You knew about that. Course I did. Who do you think helped him set up that video call thing on his computer? His hands were too shaky after the stroke. She took a sip of her punch. Frank didn't know. Your dad was real clear about that. Said Frank would only interfere. Across the room, Frank was watching us, eyes narrowed. Mrs. Mackenzie, would you have time to talk later? Privately? She nodded, understanding immediately. Come by after this circus is over. I've got some things your daddy left for you anyway. I squeezed her hand gratefully just as Frank approached, inserting himself between us. Irene, thank you for coming. Dad always appreciated your friendship. His tone was warm, but his body language was pure warning. I see you've reacquainted yourself with my sister. Never needed reacquainting, Irene said tartly. Unlike some people, I kept up with both of Harold's children. She shuffled away, leaving Frank glaring after her. What did she mean by that? I asked. Who knows? She's getting senile. Frank turned to me, dropping his voice. Look, I know what you're doing. Trying to rewrite history now that Dad's gone. It won't work. Everyone here knows the truth. Do they? Frank? Do they know you've been intercepting my letters for years? That you told Dad I refused to speak to him when he first tried to reach out to me? Something dangerous flashed in his eyes. Be careful, Amelia. You're not part of this family anymore. You don't get to come back now and stir up trouble. I'm not here to stir up trouble, I said quietly. I'm here to honor Dad and what he wanted. What he wanted, Frank repeated, a bitter smile twisting his lips. You have no idea what he wanted. But I did. It was all spelled out in the letter Dad had sent me 6 months ago. The letter detailing his final wishes, the changes to his will, and most importantly, what he'd discovered about the day I left home 30 years ago. The day Frank had finally gotten exactly what he wanted, me gone and Dad all to himself. Sigh. Afternoon sun cast long shadows across Mrs. Mackenzie's porch as I knocked on her door. The reception had finally ended, with Frank making it clear he expected me back at the house for family discussions. I'd promised to be there in an hour. It was all the time I had. Come in, Mrs. Mackenzie called, her voice stronger than her frail appearance suggested. The inside of her home smelled like cinnamon and old books, comforting and familiar. Teas. Already on, she said, gesturing to a small table where 2 cups waited. Your daddy and I had tea every Thursday for 20 years. He'd want us to observe the tradition. I sat across from her, noticing the tremor in her hands as she poured. How bad was it? After I left? She considered the question, adding sugar to her cup. Your daddy was broken for a long time. Wouldn't speak your name. Frank made sure of that. What do you mean? Frank convinced your father you'd said terrible things when you left, that you hated him and never wanted to speak to him again. She sipped her tea, watching me over the rim. Took me years to convince Harold that couldn't be right, that the girl I'd watched grow up wouldn't just cut ties so completely. My hand shook, tea spilling onto the saucer. Frank told Dad I hated him, she nodded. And intercepted your letters. I caught him once, taking mail from your daddy's box. Said he was protecting Harold from more disappointment. The familiar ache of betrayal spread through my chest. I'd written dozens of letters those first few years, apologizing, explaining, begging to come home. When no response came, I'd eventually stopped trying. 5 years after you left, your daddy had his moment of clarity, Mrs. Mackenzie continued. Found one of your old letters Frank had missed. Started asking questions. That's when I told him. I'd seen Frank taking his mail. That's when Dad reached out to me, I whispered. Yes, though I suspect Frank still managed to intercept most of his letters to you as well. She sighed, setting down her cup. By the time you two reconnected, Frank had a strong hold on everything. The house, the finances, your daddy's care. Harold was afraid of pushing too hard. She stood shakily, moving to a bureau in the corner. Which brings me to why you're here. From a drawer, she pulled out a manila envelope much like the one in my suitcase. Your daddy left this with me 3 months ago. Made me promise I'd give it only to you, and only after he was gone. My throat tightened as I accepted it. Did you read it? No need. Harold told me what it contained. Her eyes, roomy with age but sharp with intelligence, met mine. Letters he wrote you that never got sent. Bank statements showing money you sent for his care that he never received. And documents about the house. I frowned. The house? Your grandmother's house. Your mother's mother. She left it to both you and Frank equally. But Frank's been living there, claiming it as his own since her death 15 years ago. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I'd never even known my grandmother had died, let alone that she'd left me anything. There's more, Mrs. Mackenzie said, lowering herself back into her chair. Your daddy changed his will 6 months ago. Had a lawyer friend help him do it privately. No, I said quietly. He told me in his last letter. She nodded, unsurprised. Frank's been telling everyone you abandoned your daddy, that you only came back now for the inheritance. But Harold knew the truth. He knew who really cared for him. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside were exactly the documents she'd described, plus something else. A handwritten letter dated just 2 weeks before Dad's death. Dearest Amelia, it began. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. I've instructed Irene to give you these papers only after the funeral, because I know how Frank will react. I was a coward for too long, letting him control everything because it was easier than fighting. I won't be a coward in death. Tears blurred my vision as I read his confession of regret, his apology for believing Frank's lies for so many years, his gratitude for my forgiveness and financial support through his illness. The new will makes everything right, Dad had written. The truth will finally come out. I only hope you and Frank can someday heal what was broken. I carefully folded the letter, wiping my eyes. Thank you for keeping this safe. Mrs. Mackenzie reached across the table, her paper-thin skin cool against my hand. Your daddy loved you, Amelia. He made mistakes, terrible ones, but he loved you. I know, I whispered. I forgave him a long time ago. It's not your daddy who needs forgiveness now, she said, her gaze drifting toward the window, toward my childhood home where Frank waited. It's your brother. The question is, after everything he's done, can you find it in your heart to forgive him too? I tucked the envelope into my purse, the weight of its contents nothing compared to the weight of the decision ahead of me. In my suitcase at Frank's house sat my own envelope of evidence, everything I'd gathered over the years. Combined with what Mrs. Mackenzie had given me, I now had enough proof to destroy Frank completely. The question wasn't whether I could forgive him. The question was whether I would. Frank was waiting on the porch when I returned, arms crossed and face set in a grimace. The dusky evening light cast harsh shadows across his features, making him look older, harder. Family meeting started 20 minutes ago, he said, not bothering to hide his irritation. Everyone's waiting. I didn't realize there was a schedule. For grieving, I replied, stepping past him into the house. The living room fell silent as I entered. Susan sat primly on the edge of the sofa, while Jessica and Michael huddled together in the window seat. A tall, balding man in an expensive suit stood by the fireplace, a folder in his hands. This is Philip Warren, Dad's attorney, Frank said, closing the door behind me. He's here to read the will. I met the lawyer's gaze. Mr. Warren? That's strange. My father told me his attorney was James Hoffman. Warren cleared his throat uncomfortably. Mr. Hoffman handled some matters for your father, yes, but I've been the Norton family attorney for 15 years. I see. I set my purse down carefully. keeping the envelope from Mrs. Mackenzie hidden inside. Then please, proceed. Frank gestured for me to sit, his smile tight. We've already covered the preliminaries. Philip was just getting to the distribution of assets. The lawyer nodded, avoiding my eyes as he read from the document. To my son, Frank Norton, I leave the family home at 847 Maple Street, all its contents, and my remaining financial assets, with the understanding that he will continue to manage these assets responsibly, as he has done throughout my illness. Frank's expression remained neutral, but I saw the slight lift at the corner of his mouth. Victorious. Warren continued, To my daughter Amelia Norton, I leave my personal effects, including my military medals, photographs, and journals, with the hope that she will remember her father kindly. That was it. No mention of grandmother's house, no mention of the new will, just trinkets and mementos, the inheritance of an estranged child. Is that all? I asked, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. Warren nodded, closing the folder. That concludes the will as filed with my office. Frank stood, extending his hand to the lawyer. Thank you, Philip. We appreciate you coming out on such a difficult day. Of course, my condolences again to the entire family. Warren shook Frank's hand, nodded politely to me, and left, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. The front door closed with a soft click. For a moment, no one spoke. Well? Frank said finally, turning to me with feigned sympathy. I know this must be disappointing after coming all this way. It's not about the inheritance, Frank. Of course not, he agreed, his tone patronizing. It's about honoring Dad, which you've done. So I assume you'll be heading back tomorrow? Susan stood abruptly. Kids, let's give your father and aunt some privacy. I'll start dinner. Jessica hesitated, her gaze lingering on me with unexpected sympathy before her mother ushered her and her brother from the room. The door closed behind them, leaving Frank and me alone with 30 years of unspoken truths. That wasn't Dad's real will, I said quietly. Frank's expression hardened. Excuse me? You heard me. That wasn't the will Dad signed 6 months ago with James Hoffman. You're delusional, Frank laughed, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. Dad would never change his will without telling me. Like he'd never reconnect with me without telling you? I reached for my purse, extracting the envelope. I have proof, Frank, of everything. The new will, the letters you intercepted, the money you stole. He stared at the envelope, his face draining of color. What the hell are you talking about? Dad and I have been in contact for years. Did you really think you could intercept every letter? Every phone call? He knew what you were doing, Frank. Hiding my letters, stealing the money I sent, lying about me. You're making this up, he said, his voice rising. You abandoned us. Abandoned him. You don't get to rewrite history. Now that he's gone, I laid the papers on the coffee table one by one. Bank transfers from my account to Dad's, with withdrawals the same day by you. Letters I sent that were found in your desk drawer. Dad's journals detailing your lies. Frank's hands shook as he leaned over the evidence. This doesn't prove anything. And this, I said, placing the final document on the table. Dad's new will, legally witnessed and filed with James Hoffman. Equal distribution of all assets, including grandmother's house, which you've been living in rent-free despite it, being half mine. This is forged, Frank hissed, but the panic in his eyes told me he knew it wasn't. You had everything, Frank. The house, Dad's attention, the family you always wanted. But that wasn't enough, was it? You had to erase me completely. You left, he shouted, mask finally slipping. You walked away from this family. I was 16. Dad threw me out because of your lies, and you stood there and let it happen. Frank stepped back as if struck. I didn't. You told him I was sleeping with your best friend. You planted evidence, made him believe I was some kind of delinquent, all because you couldn't stand sharing his attention, even after Mom died. The color drained from Frank's face. How did you? Dad figured it out years ago. He just didn't have the courage to confront you. I gathered the papers back into the envelope. Tomorrow, I'm going to Hoffman's office to officially file the real will. After that, we'll need to discuss what happens with the properties. Frank's eyes narrowed. Calculation replacing shock. No one will believe you. Not in this town. You're the daughter who ran away. I'm the son who stayed. Maybe, I conceded. But the law will believe these documents. And I think Susan and your children should know the truth about the man they're living with. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. How do you think Jessica would feel knowing her father drove her aunt away when she was exactly Jessica's age now? For the first time, genuine fear flashed across Frank's face. You wouldn't. I don't want to, I admitted. I didn't come here for revenge, Frank. I came to honor Dad's wishes, that his children find peace with each other. I sighed, suddenly exhausted. The question is, are you capable of that? Or is your hatred of me still more important than everything else? Morning light filtered through the guest room curtains as I packed my overnight bag. I'd barely slept, listening to Frank's restless pacing downstairs for hours. The confrontation had left us both raw, decades of buried truths finally exposed to oxygen. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. I opened the door to find Jessica standing awkwardly in the hallway, still in her pajamas. Aunt Amelia? Her voice was hesitant. Can I talk to you? I stepped back, inviting her in. Of course. She perched on the edge of the bed, fingers twisting in the hem of her sleep shirt. I heard you and Dad arguing last night. She looked up, eyes so like my own. Is it true? Did he really make Grandpa think you abandoned him? I sat beside her, choosing my words carefully. Family history is complicated, Jessica. Your father and I have very different memories of the past. But Grandpa's journal? You've read it? I asked, surprised. She nodded. He let me read parts sometimes when Dad wasn't around. He wrote about you a lot, especially in the later entries. She pulled a small leather-bound book from her pocket. I took this from his room yesterday. I thought you should have it. My hands trembled as I accepted the journal. Does your father know you have this? No. Dad never let anyone touch Grandpa's things. She bit her lip. There's an entry about you from just before Grandpa got really sick, about how proud he was of you becoming a doctor, helping kids. I clutched the journal to my chest, emotion tightening my throat. Thank you, Jessica. This means more than you know. I want to know the truth, she said, suddenly fierce. Not just Dad's version. You're the only one who can tell me. Before I could respond, heavy footsteps approached in the hallway. Jessica? Frank's voice called. What are you doing? She stiffened, panic flashing across her face. I quickly slipped the journal into my bag as Frank appeared in the doorway, his expression darkening when he saw us together. Breakfast is ready, he said tightly. Your mother's looking for you. Jessica stood, casting me an apologetic glance before slipping past her father. Frank remained, filling the doorframe, his gaze fixed on my half-packed bag. Running away again? He asked coldly. I'm meeting with James Hoffman at 10, I replied, continuing to pack. I have a flight home tomorrow morning. This isn't over, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You won't win, Amelia. This is my town, my family. Our family, I corrected, whether you like it or not. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Susan's already upset. The kids are confused. Is that what you want? To tear apart another family? The accusation stung, as he knew it would. I'm not the one who built a life on lies, Frank. His jaw clenched. I protected Dad from your betrayal. I was there when you weren't. Because you made sure I couldn't be, I hissed, finally losing my composure. You stole my letters, my money, my chance to make things right with him for years. I did what I had to do. For who, Frank? For Dad or for yourself? He had no answer, just seething silence. I'll be back after my meeting with Hoffman, I said, regaining control. We can discuss next steps then. Unless you'd prefer to let the lawyers handle everything? Frank's expression shifted from anger to calculation. Fine. We'll talk when you return. Civilly. Something in his tone set off warning bells. Frank never surrendered this easily. As soon as he left, I finished packing, including Dad's journal and both envelopes of evidence. I wasn't taking any chances leaving them in the house. James Hoffman's office was exactly as Dad had described it, modest but impeccably maintained, with fishing trophies lining the walls. The attorney himself, a silver-haired man with kind eyes, rose to greet me. Amelia, you look just like your mother. He gestured to a chair. I've been expecting you. I sat, placing Dad's envelope on his desk. You know why I'm here. Harold warned me there might be complications. He studied me. I understand Philip Warren conducted a will reading yesterday? Yes, a will that left everything to Frank. Hoffman nodded grimly. I suspected as much. Your father anticipated this. It's why we filed the new will with the county court directly, not just in my office. He tapped a folder on his desk. It's already the legal document of record. Relief washed over me. So Frank can't contest it? Oh, he can try, Hoffman said dryly, but he won't succeed. Harold was very thorough, had himself evaluated by 2 different doctors to establish mental competency, left video testimony explaining his decisions, even had your grandmother's will officially entered as evidence of Frank's pattern of financial manipulation. I let out a shaky breath. Dad always was meticulous when he set his mind to something. Indeed. Hoffman leaned forward. But Amelia, there's something else you should know. Something Harold instructed me to tell you privately. My pulse quickened. What is it? The new will isn't just about property division. Harold added a moral clause. He opened the folder, pointing to a paragraph. If Frank formally acknowledges his previous deception and makes amends with you, Harold wanted him to retain the family home on Maple Street. A gesture of forgiveness, he called it. I stared at the clause, emotions warring within me. Dad was a better person than either of us deserved. He loved you both, Hoffman said simply. In his final months, that became his greatest concern, that his children might find peace. As I left Hoffman's office, that clause weighed on me. Dad's final attempt to mend our broken family, to force reconciliation even from beyond the grave. I was so lost in thought that I almost missed the commotion at Frank's house, our house, as I drove up. Fire trucks lined the street, red lights, flashing against the afternoon sun. Neighbors gathered on lawns, watching as firefighters moved purposefully around the property. My heart lurched as I parked and ran toward the house. The structure itself wasn't burning, but firemen were examining the detached garage, which stood with its door wide open. What happened? I asked Mrs. Mackenzie, who stood watching from her yard. Her eyes were wide with concern. Small fire in the garage. They're saying it might have been deliberately set. Where's Frank? I scanned the crowd. She pointed to a police car parked across the street, where Frank sat in the back seat, head in his hands. That's not all, Mrs. Mackenzie said, her voice dropping. They found your father's filing cabinets broken into. Papers everywhere. Some burned. A cold realization washed over me. Frank had been looking for Dad's evidence against him and was willing to destroy it at any cost. The police station smelled of coffee and floor cleaner, a harsh fluorescent reality, after the emotional whirlwind of the past 2 days. I sat across from Detective Rivera, answering questions about the fire, about Frank, about our family history. Susan huddled in a corner with Jessica and Michael, her makeup streaked from crying. Mrs. Norton, Rivera said, glancing at his notes. Your brother claims he was simply searching for important documents when the fire started accidentally. And you don't believe him, I said. It wasn't a question. The fire marshal found accelerant traces. This wasn't an accident. He studied me carefully. You don't seem surprised. I wasn't. The desperate Frank I'd confronted last night was capable of anything. What happens now? We're holding him for questioning. Depending on the evidence, he could face charges for arson, destruction of evidence, possibly insurance fraud. The gravity of the situation settled over me. This was beyond sibling rivalry now, beyond even the inheritance dispute. Frank had crossed a line that could cost him everything: his freedom, his family, what little respect he still commanded in this town. Can I speak with him? I asked. Rivera hesitated. Briefly. I'll have an officer escort you. Frank sat hunched at a metal table, in an interview room, looking smaller somehow, diminished. He didn't look up when I entered, just continued staring at his hands. They're saying I could get 5 years, he said, his voice hollow. Susan's already talking about moving back to her parents' place with the kids. I sat across from him, saying nothing. The silence stretched between us, 30 years of it, until finally he looked up. Why did you come back, Amelia? After all this time, why couldn't you just stay away? Because Dad asked me to make peace with you. The truth felt strangely liberating. His last wish was for us to be family again. Frank laughed bitterly. Family? What does that even mean anymore? I don't know, I admitted. But setting fire to the garage wasn't the answer. I panicked. For the first time, there was no defensiveness in his voice, just tired resignation. I thought if I could find those papers, destroy the evidence. It wouldn't have mattered, Frank. The will is already filed with the court. There are copies of everything. He closed his eyes, defeat written in every line of his face. Then it's over. I've lost everything. I studied my brother, really looked at him, and saw not the manipulative tyrant of the past few days, but the scared boy who'd lost his mother too young, who'd clung to his father's approval with desperate intensity, who'd pushed away anyone who threatened his fragile sense of security. Not everything, I said quietly. His eyes opened, suspicious. Dad included a moral clause in the will. I leaned forward. If you publicly acknowledge what you did and make amends, you keep the house on Maple Street. Disbelief crossed his face. Why would he do that? Because he loved you, Frank, despite everything. And you? After everything I've done, you'd honor that clause? I took a deep breath. I didn't come back for revenge. I came for resolution. He stared at me, searching for deception. You could let me go to jail, take everything. Is that what you'd do if our positions were reversed? His silence was answer enough. I spoke to Detective Rivera, I continued. If you make full restitution for the damage and agree to counseling, he believes the DA might consider dropping the more serious charges. Why would you help me? Frank asked, genuine confusion in his voice. Because carrying hatred for 30 years nearly destroyed you, Frank. I don't want it to destroy me, too. I stood up. Think about it. Not just for your sake, but for Susan and the kids. The next morning, Frank signed a full confession. Not just for the fire, but for his decades of deception. He admitted to intercepting my letters, to hiding Dad's attempts to contact me, to siphoning away the money I'd sent for Dad's care. The hardest confession came last, admitting he'd lied about me as a teenager, fabricating stories that led to Dad throwing me out. The DA, as Rivera predicted, reduced the charges to criminal mischief and agreed to probation rather than jail time. Frank would keep his freedom, if not his pride. The reading of the real will took place that afternoon in Hoffman's office. Susan sat rigid beside Frank, still processing the revelations about the man she'd married. Jessica and Michael flanked them while I sat alone across the table. To be divided equally between my children, Frank and Amelia Norton, The family home at 847 Maple Street, my share of Norton Manufacturing and all associated assets, Hoffman read. He continued with specific bequests, Dad's military memorabilia. To Michael, his book collection to Jessica, Mom's jewelry split between me and Susan. Then came the moral clause. Should Frank Norton acknowledge his past actions and make sincere amends with his sister, ownership of the family home shall transfer solely to him, with the understanding that it will eventually pass to his children. Susan's hand found Frank's, squeezing it gently, the first sign of warmth between them since his confession. When the reading finished, Frank cleared his throat. I'd like a moment alone with my sister. Everyone filed out, leaving us facing each other across the polished table. I don't deserve your forgiveness, Frank said simply. Probably not, I agreed. But Dad thought you deserved a second chance, and looking at Jessica and Michael, I think I do too. I've been horrible to you. His voice cracked. For years, I convinced myself I was protecting Dad, protecting our family. But I was just protecting myself, my position. I was terrified of losing the only parent we had left. I know, I said quietly. I never wanted to take him from you, Frank. I just wanted to be part of his life, too. He nodded, eyes downcast. Susan wants us to start family counseling, all of us, she says. She says Jessica and Michael deserve to know their aunt. He looked up hesitantly. Would you consider visiting sometimes? Not now, but maybe. Eventually. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. That would take time if it ever came. But it was a beginning, fragile and uncertain. I'd like that, I said. And Frank, I'm keeping Dad's journals, but I'll make copies for Jessica and Michael. They should know who their grandfather really was. He nodded, a mixture of regret and relief crossing his face. Thank you. 2 days. Later, I stood at Dad's grave, placing fresh flowers beside the headstone. The cemetery was peaceful, autumn leaves drifting lazily across well-tended grass. I did what you asked, I said softly. It's not perfect, but it's a start. A gentle breeze stirred the flowers, carrying the scent of earth and grass and memories. I thought of the sign Frank had greeted me with at the airport. Welcome, disappointment. And how wrong he had been. I hadn't come as a disappointment, but as the bearer of truth, painful but necessary. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. When will you visit again? Thanksgiving, maybe? I smiled, typing back. I'd like that. Save me a seat at the table. As I walked back to my rental car, I felt lighter somehow. The burden of the past hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted, making room for something new. Not the family I'd lost 30 years ago. That could never be restored. But perhaps, in time, a different kind of family could grow in its place. One. Built not on secrets and control, but on truth and forgiveness. The kind Dad had hoped for in his final days. I took one last look at the Norton family plot before driving away. The disappointment hadn't been me. It had been the walls we built between us, the lies we told ourselves, the years we wasted. But disappointment wasn't our ending. Just a chapter in a story still being written,